So you've probably all heard by now that last week we reached an important milestone in our impacts on the biosphere and atmosphere. And for the first time in human existence, the atmosphere is at 400, or CO2 in the atmosphere is at 400 parts per million. So roughly 17% of global carbon emissions, though, are attributable to deforestation and forest degradation. And the majority of forest loss, as you probably also know, is taking place in the most biodiverse forests on the planet. These facts generate concern on many fronts, and researchers and policymakers have been struggling to address them for over 2 decades now. We recognize the need for policy to safeguard biodiversity and to limit CO2 emissions because of the work of many scientists who have been studying the causes and consequences of deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, even before there was momentum toward policy. Today, we're extremely fortunate to have 4 speakers here who can help us tie these ideas together and share insights on the demands and challenges that lie ahead. The title of this conference comes from the recognition that climate policy is innovating tactics to reduce CO2 emissions and increase carbon sequestration, while biodiversity conservation does not command the same global attention. This is likely due to a variety of reasons. Changes in the atmosphere will have measurable effects on us all, while the extinction, for example, of the Java rhino in Vietnam in 2011 may go largely unnoticed and unremarked upon. In addition, carbon markets create a financial incentive for conservation, which, idealism aside, is often what is required to effect widespread change. This next figure shows us locations around the world that contain a highly threatened species according to the IUCN Red List. The sites in yellow already have some degree of protection, but the majority of sites, those in red, are unprotected. And another thing you may notice is that the overwhelming majority of these sites are located in tropical regions. On this map, we see terrestrial carbon stocks, and it's easy to see that there's a large overlap in the regions then that require biodiversity conservation and offer opportunities for carbon sequestration and storage. So during the last 5 years, there's been a lot of positive, truly innovative policy creation to protect and increase forest carbon stocks. The concept of an international policy for reducing CO2 emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries was approved as the UN program in 2008. This was a great and highly innovative step forward for limiting atmospheric carbon. In addition, it was immediately recognized that increasing forest carbon stocks or preventing the release of carbon from forests without consideration of biodiversity could have severe unintended consequences. Later work on REDD therefore states that, quote, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries can promote co-benefits and may complement the aims and objectives of other relevant international conventions and agreements. These co-benefits can include the protection of biodiversity in forests that are being managed as carbon reserves. That's extremely important because even if you never personally experience the amphibians or plants that are going extinct, they're all interconnected parts of tightly functioning ecosystems with lengthy evolutionary histories. Biodiversity is key to ecosystem functioning, and beyond our quantification of its role or purpose, each species has an intrinsic right to its existence. REDD was then extended to REDD Plus in 2010 as a far-sighted movement toward a holistic policy to combine the needs to reduce atmospheric CO2 and to ensure the protection of biodiversity. We're therefore at a point at which we have both a scientific understanding of tropical forest biodiversity and its relationship to tropical forest functioning and stability. And we also have the policy tools to simultaneously address climate change and biodiversity conservation. Dr. Panfil is technical advisor to REDD Plus initiatives at CI. He focuses on the assessment of the social and environmental performance of REDD Plus projects, and he's worked in CI's REDD Plus projects around the world, from Madagascar to Mexico. Prior to working with CI, Dr. Panfil managed the climate, community, and biodiversity standards, which are the most widely used social and environmental standards for forest carbon projects at the Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance. In his time at the CCBA, he co-authored the Social and Biodiversity Impact Assessment Manual for REDD Plus projects. And he's been deeply involved in providing training to implement REDD Plus, and he's taught courses on the social and environmental aspects of REDD in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Dr. Panfil has been dedicated to forest conservation for years, and before he worked at the CCBA, he was the executive director for the Amazon Conservation Association. His own research is in patterns of plant diversity in landscapes affected by climate change in the Amazon basin. Today, Dr. Panfil will speak on his work at CI, describing the biodiversity goals of REDD+ projects and measurements of their success.
Hi, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to be here. We are in the after lunch hour, which is often challenging, and as Val and I were just discussing, we often don't give talks that go for 45 minutes or an hour. And so I'm hoping that as we go along in this, if you guys have questions, you should go ahead and raise your hands, and we can sort of talk it along as we go. So I'm going to start off just by, oh, it's down below? Yeah, okay. Just take a pause for a second and just tell you a little bit about my own experience with forest carbon or with REDD activities. I, after finishing graduate school, had the chance to go and work for a conservation organization which managed a number of reserves in southern Peru. We had really nice, generous funding to get these places set up, get off the ground. We knew right at the beginning that long-term financing for these areas was going to be a challenge, but of course we were very happy to get the money to get started. And as with many conservation organizations, we very quickly started to look at, well, what are the options? How can we actually pay for, have conservation pay for itself? And we looked at some of the typical things like ecotourism, non-timber products, even trying to charge researchers in order to fund some of the conservation activities. That last one in particular turned out to be a really bad idea because forest ecology researchers would much rather stay in a tent than pay anything more than is absolutely necessary. So just about the time that the money was really starting to dry up from those initial investments in the conservation projects, the idea of REDD was really starting to gain steam, and this was in the build-up to the UN talks in Bali in 2007. And we thought, wow, here finally is a chance where we can sell something or have the forest actually be paying for its own existence. And so we quickly started to look for how we would go about doing the necessary measurements to estimate what those the emissions reductions that we were actually achieving were, who would be out there willing to pay for it. And of course, we weren't the only ones that were doing this at that time. As we look back over these last 6 or so years, there are, I think in some ways it's pretty exciting to look back and see how much has been done around the world. And it's also pretty terrifying because there are, and which I'll show you here in a few minutes, quite a few of these REDD projects that are now going on around the world, and quite a few that are at the point of saying, okay, well, what comes next? I'm about to have certified carbon credits, and is there actually going to be any demand to pay for these things? So that's something that's still to be determined. But what I'm going to talk about is how these projects are approaching biodiversity conservation. So I'll spend a couple of minutes just talking about some of the real basics, the relationship between REDD and biodiversity, talk about the standards that emerged in the voluntary space for biodiversity for REDD projects. Talk about what sort of specific goals these projects set out to achieve in terms of biodiversity benefits, and some real brief description of what they're doing in order to actually measure so that they can demonstrate that they are delivering these biodiversity benefits. I'll have a few slides to show you a bit about what one of these projects looks like on the ground. It's in a protected area called the Alto Mayo Protected Forest in Peru. It's one that CI has been involved in developing. And then just wrap up with a few conclusions about what I'm seeing so far in terms of biodiversity projects and REDD projects and biodiversity. So the real basic question, is REDD good for biodiversity? Many of us really were tantalized by the idea that, and in general terms, the idea that if you can have a way to keep forest from being cut down, that you're doing something good for biodiversity, I think, generally does hold. And in fact, a lot of the things that, lead to emissions of greenhouse gases from forests are also things that lead to a reduction in biodiversity. So timber extraction, agriculture and livestock production, firewood, fires, and some of the large infrastructure development that's happening across much of the tropics. And also, of course, many of the things that we might do in order to conserve carbon stocks or preventing emissions from forests also are very good things that are for biodiversity. So establishing protected areas, promoting local land management, often, of course, not always. It can be a good thing for biodiversity. Promoting better management and use of forest, reduced impact logging, ecotourism, for example, agroforestry, and better use of fire. But the converse doesn't necessarily hold true. So if we look at the forest just through this climate lens, and the climate lens being how do we store carbon in vegetation, of course that doesn't always create benefits for biodiversity. And so we've got all of these different areas. If all we're doing is trying to quantify how much carbon we've got in the different types of vegetation, these have wildly different significance for biodiversity between montane forest, maybe tropical dry forest, and these different types of plantations. Okay. Okay. And of course, I think you could very well argue that that if that's a eucalyptus plantation or something like that, that's not really a forest either. But I think you understand the point. And this, I think, point has been made already today, but there is the question of how does biodiversity overlap with carbon stocks, and in fact, broadly speaking, well, yeah, we know that the Amazon basin is important for biodiversity and that it has pretty high carbon stocks. So if we were able to broadly protect all of the Amazon basin, we would be doing a very good thing for biodiversity. But we also know that there's quite a bit of difference in terms of the significance of some areas, and so we could have some place like the Atlantic forest in Brazil down there, which is not as high in carbon stocks as some other areas, but of course is extremely important in terms of biodiversity. Another place like Madagascar similarly has only a relatively small amount of forest lands, which really have a high concentration of carbon, but all across, even between the humid forests and dry forests of Madagascar, are incredibly important for biodiversity. And at a smaller scale, there's a very big question still about whether or not REDD or avoided deforestation activities are actually going to be benefiting the areas that are most important for biodiversity conservation. Okay. I do want to flag one hopeful thing in relation to REDD and biodiversity, and that is that this idea that preventing deforestation can generate really important biodiversity benefits and also social benefits is something that is quite easily grasped by the general public and is quite compelling. And this figure comes from a survey of a couple of hundred companies that were voluntarily purchasing offsets for their emissions. And they were posed the question, what is it that leads to your interest in forest carbon offsets as opposed to landfill gas or any of the many other types of offsets that they could be buying? And far and away, the two most important things to them were the potential of forest carbon activities to be generating biodiversity and also social or local community benefits. I want to follow up that slide talking about money in the interest of companies to just say that it isn't like money is raining from the sky for REDD activities and REDD projects. And the information that I'll be presenting in the rest of this talk really comes from a very small total investment in these types of projects. And what this figure shows here is just a comparison of the different sizes of different markets for carbon. The European Union's emission trading scheme, here is the giant there, 118 billion. This is a couple years old, and you may have heard about the crash in the ETS over the last recent time. But nevertheless, the story holds more or less true here. So we've got this giant here for the EU's emission trading scheme, the clean development mechanism. Far and away the biggest of all of these different pots of money that have been out there being traded for carbon. Neither of those, the ETS completely excluded forest carbon, and so that's totally outside of and unrelated to what's been going on in REDD. The clean development mechanism had a way or has a way in which projects can generate emissions reductions through reforestation activities, but because of the way that it was set up, it's really been a complete flop, and there's really no forest carbon at all represented in that sphere. So where is forest carbon on all of this? It's basically over here in this voluntary over-the-counter market. And those $326 million of voluntary transactions include forest carbon and other types of projects as well. And so, so overall forest carbon is, if we're talking, and I don't remember the most recent figures, but we're talking on the order of tens to maybe 100 million or something like that, that has been going into forest carbon projects around the world. So overall, it's really not a huge amount of money.
What does total value 2009 represent?
That's all of these combined. Yeah.
In millions?
Billions of. No, that should be millions. That's an error. That's got to be an error there. Yeah. 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 Okay. Back when the idea of generating emissions reductions from forests, and specifically from conserving forests or avoiding deforestation, came around, one of the very earliest projects, which you may have heard about, is the Noel-Kempff Mercado project in Bolivia. That was set up in the mid to late 90s. And at that time, there were no rules. And so it was an idea where, well, logically it makes sense if you can prevent these trees, which are 50% carbon, from being cut down, burned, rotted, whatever else, and ending up in the atmosphere, that should have a value. But when that project was set up, there were no rules for how you should go about doing that. Having rules is tremendously important if you want to try to develop a market. People have to know what it is that they're getting really what the seller is telling them that they're selling. And particularly in the case of an intangible product like a carbon offset is. So in the last decade or so, I'll just skip ahead for 1 second. There's been a proliferation of different standards to try to help the people that are generating emissions reductions to do it in a credible way, and to reassure buyers that they're getting what they're paying for. These different standards have had different niches. We've got something like the Plan Vivo standard, which was set up really to promote very small-scale community-led forest carbon projects. The UNFCCC through the Clean Development Mechanism, which set up rules for doing afforestation and reforestation projects. And some of these have gone defunct, like the Chicago Climate Exchange. And then you've got two others, which I'll get to in just a second, which have sort of emerged as the leading standards for these kinds of projects, and that's the Verified Carbon Standard and the CCB standards. And it's the CCB standards, Climate, Community, and Biodiversity Alliance standards, that have what are the most widely used rules in terms of how forest carbon projects should be treating biodiversity. Going to jump back here for just a second, just as a reminder about the scale that I'm talking about here during this presentation. So I'm talking about this side right here, which are the projects. And these, even though they could be potentially in the order of a couple of million hectares, which may not sound tremendously, which may sound quite large, in many cases are as small as only tens of hectares for some of the very small reforestation projects. They are led by a range of different actors, potentially basically anybody. In practice, the projects that have been developed to date are very frequently led by conservation NGOs, and there are also a handful of private companies that have gotten involved in this space with very high expectations, often that this was going to lead to a much larger market than has emerged so far. And these very frequently, these types of projects are funded through pure donations, although there have been a few investments from private sector buyers hoping to be able to turn around and sell carbon credits down the road. I'm not talking at this scale, the scale of government-led programs, and Val's going to be talking much more about REDD and biodiversity at this scale in her presentation immediately after this. There are a lot of different considerations when you look at these two scales. Some of them have to do simply with the practical aspects of the size of the activities. So instead of a maximum of maybe a couple of million hectares for some of the large REDD projects over here, you know, we're talking here at the scale of entire countries. The sources of funding so far for these government programs have come from other governments. So we're not talking also sort of a different set of political and other considerations quite different from the sort of highly flexible funding and often very rapid funding that is able to be generated in the private sector. And there are important discussions and differences about the way in which the emissions reductions are actually can be generated at the national scale. And in some countries, they very much imagine their REDD programs to be essentially a series or a collection of project-level activities. And in other cases, it may be that it's something much more essentially top-down, where policies are put in place at the national scale that are expected to generate emissions reductions, and these are then monitored. So anyway, I'm just talking about this. Okay. So going back to standards, this. Just ignore that one on that side, but this figure here is just showing that over these years in the voluntary market, forest carbon projects have increasingly been coalescing around this idea of using two different standards. This verified carbon standard, which has worked very hard to try to develop rigorous rules for how you go about quantifying the emissions reductions that are generated out of the projects. And the CCB standards, which focus on ensuring that the projects aren't causing harm to the local environment or to local communities, and in fact that there's a requirement through the CCB standards that the projects are generating both social and environmental benefits. So not just do no harm, but do good. So the verified carbon standard deals with some of these technical issues that have to do around the accounting for the greenhouse gases, issues like additionality. Are those really emissions that wouldn't have happened without the project? How do you go about measuring that in a rigorous way? How do you quantify the displacement of emissions from the project area to other areas? How do you ensure that those emissions reductions are permanent, and that after the project finishes that they aren't going to go back up into the atmosphere? How do you ensure that projects are registered in a way that prevents them from selling the same emissions reduction 2 times? Those are the things that the VCS focuses on. The CCB standards were designed one, to help promote good project design. So how do you ensure that the organization that's developing the project is getting that project up off the ground in a way that is going to be uses good management practices, is going to be generating benefits for local communities, which should make the project more sustainable in the long term. It's one way to address this issue of permanence or concern that the emissions would be lost later. Includes the biodiversity aspect and the requirement of creating biodiversity benefits. So that's something that rules out cutting down low carbon native forest or vegetation and replacing it with eucalyptus or some other fast-growing species that may be able to capture a lot of carbon. Also elements around ecosystem services, so not just looking at the biodiversity value of forests, but the other services that the forests provide. Management sustainability, and even a climate change adaptation. So thinking ahead about how these projects can not just be about mitigation, but also contributing to adaptation. So I'll run through some of the key requirements in these standards around biodiversity, just so that you can get a sense for what it is that these projects actually are being asked to do. So to start with, they've simply got to provide a description of what the current biodiversity situation is at the project site. And as is the case with many of these criteria, there is not a whole lot of detail there around what kind of data you've got to present, how thorough you need to be. It's really up to the project proponent to decide what is good enough. And I'll show in a couple minutes the process, but there are really two ways in which these projects can be scrutinized. One is that the CCB standards require a real high degree of transparency. So projects are required to publish all of their project design document, their monitoring plan, their monitoring reports, and statements about what it is that they've actually achieved. So these have to be made publicly available to the international community through the internet, and they've also got to identify locally appropriate ways of getting this information out. And then each of these projects has to use an independent auditor to also do a review to understand whether or not the project has actually met the criteria that are in the standards. So while the standards themselves don't provide a whole lot of detail about what sort of description or how you would justify that your project meets a lot of these other criteria, there are these other levels of scrutiny that happens for the project. It's not a perfect system by any means, but I think that there are some real positive sides to it. In addition to this more general description of biodiversity, there's got to be an assessment of whether or not there are any of these high conservation values in the area. David mentioned this in relation to the RSPO. And three of these HCVs, which is now a fairly widely used way to assess conservation value of forests, three of them, of the six, really focus on biodiversity-specific criteria. So about whether or not there are significant concentrations of endangered and vulnerable species, for example, whether or not there are viable populations of species that occur within the project site. Threatened or rare ecosystems, all of these things, and there are some fairly detailed guidelines that have been published about how you go about doing these sorts of assessments. And then there's this requirement to describe how this area would look like in the absence of this project. So what would happen to the biodiversity at the project area if there is no project? And so this is very analogous to the type of baseline that all of the projects have to do for carbon stocks also. So in order to calculate emissions reductions, and say this is an avoided deforestation project, you have to make this projection of what the emissions or the carbon stocks would be like in that area if nothing was done under a business as usual scenario. You actually calculate the emissions reductions from the project by comparing measurements of carbon stocks in the future against that baseline. Well, the same idea holds for a biodiversity reference scenario. The projects are expected to take their projections of what land use would be like without a project and make some sort of a description for what that would mean for biodiversity. And so then what do the projects actually have to do? Well, one, they have to show that they have at least maintained or possibly even enhanced these areas that are considered to have high conservation values. They've got to do ongoing monitoring in order to estimate or to be able to document what the current biodiversity conditions are in the future. And then that with project scenario, which actually isn't a scenario as you go along, this is based on your actual monitoring data of biodiversity, has to be compared with that without project scenario or projection that you did at the beginning. And the overall requirement here is that you've got to demonstrate that you've made a net biodiversity benefit. So in the event that there may have been some biodiversity losses, those need to be compensated with biodiversity benefits. How you do that is not specified well within the standards. It's open to a lot of interpretation, but it is on the, it's a burden for the project developer to come up with that justification. There are a few other requirements related to biodiversity that are a bit more of sort of tick-the-box type of things. So invasive species can't be introduced through project activities. If any non-native species are used as part of project activities, there has to be a good justification for it. So perhaps a justified use of non-natives would be planting degraded lands with a fast-growing species for fuel wood, which might take pressure off of native forest. There's a requirement there not to be using genetically modified organisms to generate any of the emissions reductions. So no super trees that suck in carbon at a super high rate. That's not allowed. And you've also got to try to identify what the off-site impacts are likely to be for biodiversity. So this is also very analogous to the carbon piece and about the concern, the leakage concern, where emissions would be displaced from a carbon site, from the carbon project area to another area. If you clamp down on deforestation in one area, you have to be able to estimate and monitor what sort of off-site impacts there are. Well, a very similar thing needs to be done for biodiversity. Each of the projects is required to develop a monitoring plan and to make this publicly available as well, to show how they're actually going to measure all these great things that they say that they're going to achieve for biodiversity. But again, the guidance that comes out of the CCB standards is really quite general. There's this line in there that says, well, potential variables may include species abundance, population size, habitat area, and on and on. And so it's really quite wide open as to what the projects are permitted to do. So with the idea of trying to get a bit of a better sense of what they're actually doing, we've started to do a review of some of these project documents. And the fact that all of the project documents are publicly available is really a nice source of information about what's happening out there. And so I'm going to show some information from that in just a second. Just to finish off on the requirements and the standards, there's one other optional gold level criterion, which it turns out that actually quite a few projects are meeting in one way or another. But it's if projects are able to demonstrate that they're particularly important for conservation in terms of protecting globally threatened species, or areas that are considered to be irreplaceable in terms of representing areas that are particularly important for a particular species in terms of the global population of that species, then projects can qualify for this optional, what's called a gold level criterion. Okay. And just to repeat what I started to talk about before about the process and so how these projects are actually evaluated. Each one of these projects has to go through a two-step evaluation. One is the validation. So this is a professional review of the actual project design. It's before the projects have actually, it's simply the design. It doesn't include any sort of monitoring results or demonstration that the project has actually generated any of these benefits. So that's called the validation. And then a verification is a second review that has to happen within 5 years of that validation. And so the verification is when the project has to make publicly make available information about what the climate benefits, the community benefits, and the biodiversity benefits are from the project. Okay. Okay. So to give you a bit of a picture of what this globally, what the project level work or REDD work looks like, I'll show a bit of data drawn from the project documents that have been submitted to the CCBA. So you can see back from that time that I started talking about at the very beginning of my talk, there was really the dawn of what I would say has been pretty remarkable growth in the number of projects that are out there. And as of today, there are more than 70 projects around the world that have been certified or validated to the CCB standards. These other figures, this little line down here, are the projects that have actually reached this verification stage. So these are the ones that have actually gotten far enough to be able to make a claim that they actually have generated these multiple benefits that they said they were going to create. And I don't think that there's any trend here with that little dip going down. In fact, that's only because it's a partial year, and that's information up through May of this year. So altogether, 72 projects have been validated. 12 of these projects have passed through this verification stage. There are another 3 that are in the midst of that verification process right now. Another 23 projects that are out there undergoing the validation stage right now, and 9 projects that, for varying reasons, were not validated. So so there are projects that don't make it through at least even that first step. Where are these projects around the world? Well, a lot of them are in Latin America, and actually a fairly significant piece of the pie is from Africa as well, which I always think is interesting and good to see. Under the Clean Development Mechanism, which was envisioned as being an important technology transfer mechanism to the developing world, Africa really came out or never met up to that expectation of being able to host a lot of projects, and so in the forest carbon arena, there actually are a large number of projects that are happening there. Brazil is definitely the leading country in terms of numbers of projects that are out there, and you can see some of the other leading players. What types of projects are out there? We hear an awful lot about REDD, and that is discussed far more than this other category, afforestation, and reforestation, which was something that generated a huge amount of attention during the development of the Clean Development Mechanism. But under and in fact, it turns out that even though under the Clean Development Mechanism, these afforestation and reforestation projects really never amounted to much, they still have a life in the voluntary market, and around half of all the projects that are out there right now fall in that category. The REDD projects dominate most of the rest of the other half, and there are a number of projects that combine avoided deforestation activities together with other activities like, for example, improved forest management. How big are these projects? Well, in terms of emissions reductions and in terms of land area, they're really enormously variable. And so some of the projects are very small scale, so up to 16,000 tons of carbon per year, to some that are really quite large, those that are well over 1 million tons per year. So it's really quite a diverse space. And in general, when we look at something like this, these small projects that are down at this end are reforestation projects, often are projects that were designed to be much more community focused or community led. And the big ones that are at this end are the very large REDD projects that are probably 1 million plus hectares in area. So looking through the set of project documents, and this is just looking at the 15 that either have been verified or are in that verification step in the process of being evaluated for their verification. We just tried to get a sense for how do they self-report in terms of the threats that they're facing in their project area. Probably not too surprising that logging and wood harvesting and agriculture are the more commonly cited threats. Hunting is also cited a few times. So the red bars represent just five avoided deforestation projects that are at that verification stage. And the yellow bars represent the 10 reforestation projects that are at that stage. And these classifications are the IUCN threat categories. So this is, again, looking at those 15 projects and trying to get a sense for what is it that they actually, how do what their stated biodiversity priorities, how do those line up with broadly recognized biodiversity goals? And one of the big questions here is that this voluntary market and voluntary space for REDD really is something that globally is tiny. And if we have any hope that REDD is going to scale up, it's going to scale up through much larger sources of funding that go into national level REDD programs. So at the national scale, countries are being asked to do, in a broad sense, many of the same things that the projects have been asked to do. They have to be able to quantify their emissions reductions. They have to be able to say what are the impacts on people and what are the impacts on biodiversity. So it would be awfully nice if, and looking down the road, it seems natural that the way that these projects will have to be thinking is, well, what can I do that's going to be compatible with what my country is being asked to do in terms of reporting? Are my goals in terms of biodiversity aligned with what my country's national biodiversity goals are? So as we looked through these project documents, we tried to get a sense for, are they explicitly talking about these sorts of national biodiversity goals and trying to achieve or support those goals through their project activities. So it turns out that in the 10 reforestation projects that we've reviewed so far, none of those appears to have any explicit interest in or expectation of being able to contribute to national biodiversity goals. In the 5 avoided deforestation projects that we've looked at, just 2 of them have. And those are projects that are both happening in national protected areas. So by default, by helping support the conservation of a nationally identified priority area, which is a national park, they are contributing to the national biodiversity goals. We also tried to get a sense for how many of these projects have specifically identified species of high conservation value, ones that meet red list categories of vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And of those reforestation projects that we've looked at so far, only one of those 10, in fact, has explicitly mentioned a goal of contributing to the conservation of vulnerable or endangered species. It turns out that all 5 of those avoided deforestation projects have done that, and 2 of them also state a goal of contributing to the conservation of critically endangered species. Oops. Uh-oh. Which one do I do now?
No, that's okay. You just turn back on the slideshow.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, okay. So another question then is, how are these projects actually going about measuring these biodiversity benefits? And there are a couple ways of looking at this. One is simply that in most cases we can expect that if forests were to be cut down, or if barren land were to continue as barren land, putting trees on that land or keeping the forest standing is going to provide a biodiversity benefit. And so we see that here with this idea of monitoring habitat extent. And so all 15 of these projects have monitoring of the extent of the forest, or the reforestation activity is one of the ways in which they're claiming that they're achieving biodiversity benefits. That seems pretty logical. Another type of monitoring that you can be doing would be specifically looking at the species of conservation interest, and are there changes in those populations over time. And so actually, species, specific species goals, that were, or at least for those vulnerable and endangered species of the reforestation projects, that was only a goal in one of them. And so that project, in fact, does have some species-specific monitoring that is going on. And in the case of the avoided deforestation projects, all of them, in addition to monitoring their habitat extent, are doing some species-specific monitoring. Now, this is really a real quick and dirty review, and there's a lot of more critical analysis that can go into the monitoring that they're doing to assess whether it's really good enough to be able to track those populations and the impacts of the projects. But we haven't quite gotten into that yet. Also, to give a sense for the way in which the monitoring is being done for habitat extent, so it turns out for these reforestation projects, only 2 of those 10 projects are actually using any sort of remote sensing. And that reflects the fact that most of these reforestation projects really are aimed at community level reforestation activities. So they're not, they're very, one of the projects which is being implemented in several countries is a program called TIST. And the monitoring for the TIST program is being done through cell phones that have been distributed to community members. And so they're, instead of having someone looking at satellite images in order to see if those trees are on the ground, community members are going out and taking records of the plantations that have been done. Of course, as would probably be expected for these avoided deforestation projects, which are much larger, they're all using remote sensing methods. All 10 of those reforestation projects are using field-based methods. So even though they aren't generally doing species-specific monitoring, they are monitoring the establishment of their plantations through, right there on the ground. And then the avoided deforestation projects are using the field-based methods to monitor the species of conservation interest. Okay. So a few slides just to try to paint a picture of what one of these projects looks like. This is from the Alto Mayo Protected Forest in Peru. This is part of the National Protected Areas system in Peru. It is an area so there's the map of Peru, Pacific Ocean over here, Andes running right down the middle of Peru, basically. This is in the Department of San Martin, which is just on the eastern flank of the Andes, moving out towards the Amazon basin. San Martin happens to be a hotspot for REDD projects. And so the Alto Mayo project is this project here in green. This is a conservation concession run by a local NGO where they're also trying to develop a REDD project. And this great big huge yellow thing is the Cordillera Azul National Park, which the Field Museum here has been instrumental in supporting a Peruvian NGO to develop as a REDD project. And there are actually a couple of other forest carbon projects that are going on in this department as well. So this is the department in all of Peru that has had the highest rates of deforestation. It's estimated that about 1.6 million hectares of primary forest within San Martin have already been cleared. The Alto Mayo project completed both the validation and the verification for the VCS and the CCB standards. So it's one of those handful of avoided deforestation projects around the world to have been verified. CI is developing several REDD projects around the world, and this is the first of CI's projects to be verified. This is the first REDD project anywhere in the world in a national protected area to be verified, and it's also a relatively large one so far. It's about 200,000 hectares, but there are other ones much bigger, like Cordillera Azul, which is coming online at, I don't know, 1.1 million or something like that. Yeah. So being on the flanks of the Andes, this is an area that's widely recognized for its high diversity and high levels of endemism. It's got some interesting and very rare creatures like that little owlet there and the yellow-tailed woolly monkey. So clearly of high importance for biodiversity. But it's also a protected area that has had the highest rates of deforestation of all protected areas in Peru. It is, although it was established, I think, a couple of decades ago, has had a growing population within the protected area boundaries, so now a couple of thousand people, driven largely by the opportunity to plant coffee. And so the question here was, how do you work to address this rapid high levels of deforestation and in a way that is socially acceptable? These are, next couple of maps show the observed historical deforestation within the area. Those are these spots scattered around the park in red here. This highway here that crosses the protected area was fairly recently paved. And so that has facilitated access, dramatically facilitated access to the area. And high coffee prices have also contributed to a recent increase in deforestation over the area. And so a model, a spatially explicit model, was developed to try to estimate what sort of deforestation would look like in the future. And in fact, it's really quite dramatic, showing these widespread areas of deforestation in certain sectors of the protected area, largely the areas that are more accessible to the highway and also are suitable for growing coffee. Okay. So the goals of this project have been to try to ensure that this protected area serves its purpose, meets its the reasons that it was established by the Peruvian government. Ultimately, we're looking to try to figure out how to reduce this deforestation of these primary forests. Explicitly from the beginning, we chose an approach not of trying relocation of the many people that live within the protected area, probably for fairly obvious reasons. But although legally, almost none of the people that are there legally have a reason to or the right to remain within the protected area. The goal instead has been to try to ensure that the people that are there now, first, that additional people don't come into the area, and second, that the people that are there now are limited to only cultivating the lands that have already been cleared. There have been several different tools that have been used for trying to reduce the deforestation here. So one is through the generation of carbon offsets and the marketing of these. And so CI was very fortunate to be able to attract Disney as a primary investor in this project, which enabled CI to do the actual design development of the project and to begin project activities before the offsets were actually generated. That's often one of the big challenges for these projects, is how do you fund that development time until there's actually any sort of a carbon payoff. One of the tools that CI has used in a number of places around the world is the development of conservation agreements. So these are explicit contracts that are established with local communities whereby they commit to more environmentally friendly practices in exchange for something. In the case of this project, it's not cash payments. Instead, it's technical support and assistance with marketing of the coffee that they're producing, so that they can generate increased coffee revenues using those already deforested lands. And there's another program that's based out of CI called REDD Ventures, which has been making small-scale loans to farmers that are in the buffer zone just outside of the protected area. Also with the idea of promoting more sustainable practices. So it's sort of a combination of different approaches that's being used. And the one that doesn't show up here, but which is also quite important, of course, is simply beefing up the ability of this park to protect itself. So park guards and better ways to monitor incursions into the park. The general process here for doing a project like this is that you've got to have a really good estimates of what the actual carbon stocks are in the different forest types around the area. You've got to be able to monitor when those different types of forest and how much of each of those different types of forest is cut down and what that means in terms of emissions. And you've got to find someone out there that's willing to pay you to do this. So, again, the goal here has been to work with those people that are within the protected area to try to prevent any sort of additional deforestation and not to remove them from the area. So the next couple slides are just to maybe segue a bit into what Val will be talking about. But I think one of the important aspects or one of the tasks that faces project developers that are working on any of these 70 and projects that have been validated and the untold others that are out there that haven't gone into this validation process is making sure that they're really working with all of the different government levels that are responsible for REDD. And so when this project was first getting off the ground at the national level, well, at any of these levels, in fact, REDD really wasn't on the radar. And so developing the project has meant trying to bring along these different levels of government, bring them along in the process and help them figure out how, where it is that new policies or regulations have to be developed, or to understand how forest carbon activities fit within the existing policies. So just a few of the stats from this project. So in the first verification period from this project, 2.8 million tons of carbon were verified. So those are credits that are actually available to be sold or to be retired. Disney has had 900,000 tons of credits retired in their name in recognition of their contributions to the project start. And they will be buying more credits in the future. And the funds from this are all being channeled back into the ongoing management of the protected area. Okay. Probably some fairly obvious lessons learned, but REDD in the end is very much a local scale activity. If you don't have the right sort of engagement with local decision makers and local communities, there's a very large chance that your project won't be successful. After all, it is the local people that are there close to the trees and with chainsaws, and we're not. And so ultimately, they, and very necessarily are a key part of the project. Bringing government along is something that once government or national level policies are in place, it should be considerably easier for local level REDD initiatives to happen. But for the earlier projects, this has been a major investment in time and effort. Management of expectations is something that is extremely difficult and fraught. I think at all levels, both at the project scale and national level, nationally, there are probably unrealistic expectations about REDD, what REDD is going to be doing. Often it takes a multi-pronged approach to try to reduce the deforestation. So going back to this issue of how do projects contribute to national government programs, what's been the approach that's being used in Peru is one in which regions or the department or state level jurisdiction is really the center of REDD activity. And this is part of Peru's move to decentralize the administration of its forest areas. So all of those multiple REDD projects that I pointed out in that one map of San Martin ultimately are going to be accountable to the Department of San Martin in terms of reporting on their emissions reductions and also their social and biodiversity impacts. But in turn, each of the regions, as they're called in Peru, has the responsibility of being able to report up to the national government. And at the international scale, what's being discussed about REDD is that it's the national government that's accountable for emissions reductions all the way across the country. And it's the national government that's accountable for the social and environmental performance of the REDD activities. And so how does the region do that reporting? What sort of methods does it use to measure those climate, community, and biodiversity impacts? Well, that's still being sorted out. But presumably, these all need to be consistent for each of the regions in Peru. And basically the same thing at the project scale. So these rules that get developed here at the regional scale are going to be applying down to the projects. So for these early projects that are moving right now, there is both the challenge and opportunity, but in which they may be doing things a certain way. And it could be that in the future, if the region decides to do things in a different way, that could have a negative effect on projects. And so just another way of looking at this, we've currently got the situation where projects are using these project-level standards developed in the voluntary space. If these projects are going to continue to exist under a national level REDD scheme, it means that they're going to have to meet these other sorts of safeguards that are being established at the international level for countries. And so some of the examples are the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, which comes through the World Bank, which is funding a lot of what are called the REDD readiness activities in countries, helping governments prepare to implement REDD. Well, they all have, they have to follow the World Bank rules about how you treat social and environmental issues. The UNFCCC is establishing its own rules also about safeguards. So how do you treat social environmental issues there? And then even at this national level, there are voluntary standards which are emerging as well. Something called the REDD plus social and environmental standards are very analogous and developed by many of the same people that were involved in developing the CCB standards, now working to develop best practice standards that can apply to governments. And so this is a major question for projects right now, is how do they operate in a way that's going to be able to meet all of these emerging international rules. Okay, so just a few of the take-home messages. So far in that very small sample of projects that we've looked at, it's pretty clear that the reforestation projects that are at this verification stage are putting a much lower emphasis on biodiversity. And if you read those projects, they are projects that were generally set up with community benefits in mind, but they saw an opportunity to potentially generate revenues for the communities through the carbon markets. And because the CCB standards are very non-prescriptive in terms of what sorts of biodiversity benefits you have to create, the biodiversity component is not real detailed or in those particular projects. The avoided deforestation projects that are out there put a much stronger emphasis on their biodiversity benefits, and that's probably not. I don't think, be surprising either. These are projects that were explicitly set up in order to, in many cases, by NGOs in areas that the NGOs were thinking had been trying to protect in some way or another anyway. And some of these projects are national protected areas. So the fact that these projects are emphasizing biodiversity benefits isn't surprising. Although I think it is interesting that few of these projects were written in a way that shows that they were really thinking about national biodiversity priorities when they were being designed. The monitoring that's happening so far really emphasizes, for the most part, just the extent of the forest cover. So there's an awful lot of biodiversity information that's not being produced at this point. There are often, in the avoided deforestation projects, a handful of species that get picked out for specific monitoring. So you could criticize the fact that there isn't more detailed biodiversity monitoring going on, but on the other hand, in a lot of cases, it may be sufficient just to be looking at the overall extent of the forest, and also recognizing that the dollars that go into biodiversity monitoring potentially take away from other ways in which that, or from the money that actually goes to protecting the forest. Okay, and I guess that point actually is a repeat. So that, I think, is all, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to take them.